Well, good morning, everybody. We've made it to Friday, but it is a stunner of a day on Birds 365. I'm Mike Gill. That's John McMullen, who has 2 hours of sleep, which is just a couple more hours than I got, with the Eagles keeping us up late and doing something I don't know that any of us envisioned. We've got that today. Plus, they also signed their own. A.J. Brown gets a monster deal. We'll get into that. Paul Domowitch, the great writer, will join us in the 8 o'clock hour. Chris Franklin, NJ.com, New Jersey Advanced Media, who covers the Eagles, will be here in hour number 2. So everyone's up late last night. Everyone has been waiting and wondering. And Roseman, who probably, John, wants to make a deal, is starting to say, I might not have to make a deal. And two, it got to the point where the two guys they would have traded up to get, they then had to decide between. I don't know that anybody had that on the bingo card for Birds 365 on Friday morning.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I wouldn't consider going into round one was them staying at 22. I said, well, they might go up and they might go down, but I doubt seriously they're going to pick a 22. And boy, everything broke their way. It really
So where
did.
was the moment, John, in the draft where it started to break so much for them? Where the trade, was there any moment where you felt they're not going to trade up because they don't have to? Was there that moment that kind of like started to materialize?
Well, 14 for 14 offensive players to start, which is a record. And not only is it a record, the previous record, Mike, was 7. So, I mean, they shattered 14 consecutive offensive players to start the draft. The previous record was 7. That's how offensive heavy this draft turned out to be. And you started to go, well, if they want defense, boy, they're looking pretty darn good. Now, there was still the assumption that there were some offensive linemen that could still be in the mix. But, when we started to think it was cornerback and Quinyon Mitchell or Terrion Arnold, well, then it was a very good situation. And then Howie spoke after and said that exact thing. Once you get to 15, which was the first defensive player off the board, which is Leotow Latu to Indianapolis, Howie said, they basically you start looking at it. You got 7 players you're comfortable with and how many spots, and you're like, whoa, this is breaking our way. And then you start to think, he mentioned you always have a preference. So do you want to move up and a little and try to make sure you get your preference? And they played good game of poker, and they were able to get Quinyon Mitchell at number 22. And he ended up, I mean, that was the first, people thought he would be the first corner off the board. He was the first corner off the board. It was just a lot later than we all thought. And for the Eagles to get him at that spot, there's not much to dislike about that pick and how it shook out for the Eagles.
No, and Troy Fatanu, the tackle, was the pick right before Philly. So there was the thought of maybe, is that the guy they wanted? That's right where they maybe would have moved up one spot, going back to the conversations we had this week with Les Bowen and Martin Frank, who told us, hey, they weren't going to let somebody jump ahead of them. Well, Pittsburgh, you knew, was looking at offensive line. They get Fatano right before you. So it's pretty clear, I guess, that this is the position and this is the guy that they wanted, because they had to make the choice, John, between Mitchell from Toledo and Terrion Arnold from the SEC power Alabama. And they go with Mitchell in this spot here. So let's kind of get your thoughts on why Mitchell over Arnold. You got the choice. You didn't have to trade or get the second guy. You got to pick which one you wanted. This was a wild moment in watching this. Is, wow, which way are they going to go? I had people, tweeting at me or posting at me, whatever the heck you want to call it, where are they going to go? And I said, I don't know, man. People forget Sirianni's best friend is the head coach at Toledo. So I'm sure there was a lot of conversation and politicking for his guy there. You got the Alabama connection. They've gone to the SEC a lot. Was there a moment in your head of what are they going to do here?
Well, once, as you mentioned, Fautano, because I think he was still in the mix in Pittsburgh and he comes off the board. Then, I had veered back towards Mitchell and took him in my last mock draft. And I started with him and I ended with him.
At 22?
No, I did going up. So I got the player. I didn't get the spot.
You get points for that? Is there like a
well, Zach Berman told me to take it, so I took it, and Roman Reigns acknowledged me. Third consecutive year I've gotten a player, more than one player. Cam Jurgens I got in the second round. Jordan Davis, Nolan Smith. Yeah, it's been a good run. So I put the Roman Reigns acknowledge me chance. You don't always get the spot right because things happen. And look, I didn't think there's any way it would have been there at 22. So that's a big part of it as well. But when it came down to Mitchell versus Arnold, yeah, you're right. I mean, Nick's old college roommate is the head coach at Toledo, and Larry Karras's son, his mentor, is the defensive coordinator. So I mean, he had a probably a better framework of what this player is and has the potential to be than anybody else, because he trusts those guys so implicitly. And that certainly probably veered the Eagles in that direction. Howie did mention, Power 5 versus MAC, you worry a little bit about level of competition. But when you stand out like he stood out on the film, that helps that go away a little bit. And yeah, they just the other part was I had focused on Mitchell on Arnold late in the process, and I said, well, who's the better fit for Vic Fangio? And everybody I talked to, it's only three. There's three guys said Arnold. But and then I talked to a former GM, and he explained a pretty good point to me in that they didn't say he was all a better player. They said he was a better fit for the scheme. And the ex-GM said, "Look, man, this league moves quickly. You might not even be playing this scheme next year if things don't go well for Nick Sirianni and you bring in a new coach. He's going to probably want to bring in a new defensive coordinator, and he might be playing an entirely different scheme. So I wouldn't get caught up on picking for scheme immediately if you have a better player, and I think that's the way the Eagles landed and defaulted to. And I think he's got a higher ceiling. And that's the way they went. And that comfort factor, which you mentioned with the coaches at Toledo, I think that played a big factor into it as well.
So Arnold is the first corner off the board. The Eagles get the guy they want because they had the choice. It wasn't like, hey, maybe they wanted Terry Arnold. Nope, they had the opportunity to take him. They did not take him. They end up with Quinyon Mitchell. So, John, life moves fast, and he's here now. Now what for Arnold? You got two corners here. You said earlier this week, if you draft a corner, that James Bradbury could be a post-June 1st. Do they plug and play Quinyon Mitchell right off the bat? Does he have to come in? Is he the kind of player playing at Toledo, MAC school, that they would rather give the Lido Shepherd, Sheldon Brown treatment and hang out on the sidelines for a little while? How do you see year one for Quinyon Mitchell?
I mean, I think the hope is to get him out there and turn him into a starting cornerback very early, whether that's week one or early in the season. Look, even when you bring up guys like Lido and Sheldon, it's such a different era now. It's such a sense of urgency to get these picks on the field. That's why I have real concerns over all the quarterbacks drafted early. I mean, you got to get those guys on the field early, and I think the vast majority aren't ready to be on the field early. And I think you're going to see coaches fired, GMs fired. in the whole 9 yards. Now that's a little bit of a different position, but corner's really difficult. I've been talking about it in the lead up to the draft a lot, especially in this particular scheme, which is really complicated.
The hit rate
Really,
for corners in the NFL is 34% from the chart we were looking at the other day. 34% make it
to a
generally, and
second contract. Yeah.
to the second contract, that means the other 70+% not making it. So you're taking a guy that you're almost expecting to fail here.
Well, that's not how the Eagles look at it, obviously.
No, I'm saying as a fan, you're saying you just took a guy who there's a good chance he does not make it.
Yeah, I mean, if you play the odds, I said take the offensive lineman. He's getting the second contract.
Yep.
But if that's but I do think the league is changing from that perspective as well, and it's not about 10 years anymore. You want a corner for 10 years. No, you don't. You want somebody who can be effective on that rookie deal. And even if you have to move on, this year, I think the best example of that would be at linebacker, Patrick Queen. He's in Pittsburgh now. So he didn't get a second deal in Baltimore, but guess what? He played really well at the end of his rookie contract. And they made a run and they didn't get to where they wanted to go. But ultimately, I consider that a successful draft pick for the Baltimore Ravens, even though he doesn't get that second contract because they didn't want to pay him at that position what they were going to have to pay him. And all that complicates. It doesn't necessarily mean if you don't get a second contract, you're not a good player or a competent player. But I think the whole mentality is shifted down to it's not about 10 years. It's about 3
so on
years
this premise, is A.J. Brown considered a bust because he didn't get a second contract?
Well, yeah. And in Paul Hembo's chart that you're talking about, yes, in that instance, he didn't get a second deal with Tennessee. So technically he's not a hit. Again, there's a lot of context to that. He's obviously a hit as a player in the NFL. Had troubles with Tennessee from a contract standpoint. They didn't want to go as high. Imagine that. It was 25 million. Now he's up to 33 million or whatever starting in 2027. And that made it more of a good day for the Philadelphia Eagles getting that extension done. So
yeah, I want to get a little deeper into that extension in a little bit, but I do want to continue to kind of put the pieces of this Quinyon Mitchell pick together. Were you finishing up?
Yeah, I mean, I just think the league's changed in the fact that it's more condensed, and if they get 3-4 years out of them, that still could be a good pick. If you want to pay him, that's always a good thing. But there's certain positions where you'll hand ring, and corner's probably not one of them, to be honest. You see Slay at 33 still playing at a high level. By no means can he not get a second contract, but I think the league is now boiled down to more of a college mindset where you're constantly turning it over. 4 years in college, it's even less now, but except at certain positions, and quarterback obviously being one of them, offensive line being one of them, and the rest, there's constant turnover in the league at every other position, basically.
Yeah. So obviously people questions Mac, who did he play against? What are some of the things that the Eagles fans who have questions are going to like about this player, even with the smaller school competition that he generally faced for the most part?
Well, he's a pure outside.
This is a guy who Nick Saban said last night, if you were watching the ABC broadcast, he said he tried to get him to go to the portal to get him to go to Alabama.
Yeah.
He would not leave Toledo, but Alabama wanted him. So Alabama thought he was good enough to go to their school. Now, that doesn't mean he was good enough once he got there to get on the field, but Alabama wanted him to hit the portal so they could try to get him.
Yeah, and that was a big story with him because he was very loyal to Jason Candle, who's the head coach at Toledo, who's Nick Sirianni's, one of Nick's best friends and was his college roommate. And they played receiver together at Mount Union. They coached together at Mount Union. They've been together a long time and been friends for a long time. And when you look at especially guys who are at programs like Jason Candle in Toledo, if you think about it from that perspective, Mike, if he's got a guy who's going to be a potential first round pick in the NFL, he's going to talk that guy up because he wants him to be successful in the NFL, and then you can recruit off of that. Look what we did for insert name. That's how college works. And that's where I think the Eagles had an advantage because, all the other teams, when it came to Quinyon Mitchell, are getting the smoke blown up there, and the Eagles are getting the real deal because he's so close to Candle and Nick's so close to Candle and Vince Karras. So I do think that was an advantage, and they probably know this player better than anybody else because of that advantage. And they felt very comfortable with it. And you mentioned that's sort of those things like that's good context, Mike, that you bring up what Nick said and that they wanted him to come to Alabama because that's like we talk about, well, he's the first cornerback drafted since Lito Shepherd in the first round. The Eagles finally drafted a corner and they never draft corners. Yeah. But I talk about it all the time, but they wanted to draft J.C. Horn. They wanted to draft Patrick Surtain. They wanted to draft Derek Stingley Jr. They wanted to draft Sauce Gardner. They weren't in a position to draft them because there's 31 other teams, sometimes making goopy decisions.
That was a big theme last night. That's the first time since 2002 that they had taken a secondary player. And they did it last night, and it was unconventional. It dropped to exactly the spot they were in at the start of the night. Many people prognosticated that they would either have to move up to grab this particular player or the other one that they had to choose between. They also made the huge signing before. We'll kind of take a little deeper look at the A.J. Brown deal as well because, man, now you've got Brown and Smith, and most people say, look, you can't keep all of these guys. You got to have to make a decision. When they chose Smith, some people speculated about Brown. Well, Brown is back. So you have the core of that offense all intact, and now you have a young player on defense to start building with as well. Let's take a deeper look at that coming up next with the great Paul Domowitch, who will join us right here on Birds 365.